I have a little poetry story that I would like to tell you. It's very short. Anyway, I've been cooking with my grandson up until recently 3 days a week, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I feel him becoming more alive to the world. And he's been trying lately to memorize things. And so he said to me the other day, do you want to hear the quotations that I memorized? And I said, sure. So I have a list of them somewhere, but not right available. He had a list of 12 one-line sentences. They were from Shakespeare, Lord Byron, Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were all these poets that I had heard of. Then they had a little Lao Tzu thrown in. And he knew it all perfectly. And I said, where did you get those? And he said, every morning I have tea and I memorize them off the tea bags. Which I thought was really wonderful. Yeah. And then a couple of days later, he said, I wrote to the company because they just keep repeating the same quotations on the tea bag. And I wanted to know if they were going to do more. And he said, they wrote back and said they're trying to get more women and more recent quotations on their tea bags, and they're working on it.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was cool. Anyway, you never know.
There's a job for you, Shannon, finding the little quotes to go on the tag on the tea bag.
Yeah.
We can
you can call it poet tea.
Poet
oh,
tea.
That's good.
No, that's not good. Not good.
It's not worth your PhD, Ron, if that's the best you can do, but it was pretty good.
That was short notice.
No, it was good. I just never encourage people who do things like that.
Yeah, she doesn't. It's really annoying because I'll come up with good stuff and she barely smiles.
Well, that's because if you encourage someone who likes a good pun, they just get carried away.
My granddaughter, who is in the theater program at the University of Minnesota, she and I pun each other. We punish each other.
Precisely what I mean.
It takes high intelligence to pun. Did you know that?
No, it doesn't. No.
Yes, it does.
Well, so what we have for today is just exactly what Shannon said. Linda's going to talk a little bit about Louise, and then I'm going to toss 3 poems out at you.
So Louise, I should be able to pronounce the German since I lived in Germany for a year, but apparently the way Americans pronounce it is Glick. So is that satisfactory to everyone, or do you want a little more Germanic spin on it? I wonder how she says it.
Well, go ahead and spin it, but I'm going to follow that I found that said it rhymes with click. So I'm going to call her Glick.
It's slick that it rhymes with click. And now I'm talking about Louise Gluck, who was born in 1943, the same year, I believe, as Amory and me and Ron, in New York City. She grew up in Long Island. She went to Columbia School of Arts and Sarah Lawrence, and she published her very first book when she was 25. She has published 12 books. And I have to say, I think that all I knew about her was her name. I don't think I'd ever read any of her poetry. I am loath to admit that, but I think it's probably true.
Although we found a copy of one of her volumes on our bookshelf.
She's won many, many awards. She was poet laureate, 2002, I think. She's won the Pulitzer. She got the Nobel Prize for Literature. She got a Wallace Stevens Award, a National Book Award, a Guggenheim Grant, Lannan Literary, a Penn Award, and a Bollinger Award, and there are others as well. She has turned out these 12 books in various times, but with some regularity, between 5 to 7 years each, a new book coming. There were a couple of quotes, things that critics have said about her that I wanted to read because I wanted to think about them as we read her poetry. And here is one of them. This was from a review in the New Republic on her book Marshland, which was published in 1975. Glick's cryptic narratives invite our participation. We must, according to the case, fill out the story, substitute ourselves for the fictive personages, invent a scenario from which the speaker can utter her lines, decode the import, and solve the allegory.
Yeah.
So that sounds all very...
I beg your pardon?
Yeah. But she also says, the same critic says, you can read her poems in themselves without filling yourself in, complete in its own terms. When she got the Nobel Prize this year, it was for, and see if you need to decode this too, for her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal. All of these critical descriptions of her work don't make her sound immediately accessible, but when I read her poems, I do find her very accessible. And I think her language is straightforward and sometimes sounds a lot like ordinary speech. I wonder if you agree with that, and maybe our discussion of the poems will reveal that. One critic said, the strength of her voice derives in large part from its self-centeredness. Literally, for the words in Glick's poem seem to come directly from the center of herself. I thought that was an interesting description, coming from the center of herself. Another quote I found was this one, based on the book she wrote called Averno in 2006. Few poets save Sylvia Plath have sounded so alienated, so depressed, so often, and rendered that alienation aesthetically interesting. So I think that's another question to pay attention to. Do you feel overburdened with the depression that's registered in her poems, or do you feel enlightened by it, or can you identify with it, or is that even true? She writes a lot using, as we'll see from one of the poems Amory picked, using mythology, both Greek and Roman mythology. I like the way she talks about the ups and downs of marriage and personal relationships. And I did find out that she was married. She was married from 1977 and 1996. The book called A Village Life, which came out in 2009, was apparently one of her different books because she used long lines to give a sort of novelistic effect or short story. So she's experimented with the kinds of writing that she's done. But I found in the poems, at least, that Amory suggested, and also glancing through that book that we found on her shelf, that she's very readable, but not superficial. If you read it the second time, you want to dig into it. I think right now she is a writer in residence at Yale. At least that's what this one article said, and that she lives in Cambridge. And I think that's all I want to say about her right now. So we have plenty of time for the poems.
I'm still, I got stuck in a good way on one thing you said, Linda, that she writes from the center of herself, which to me seems like such a positive thing to do. Yet the phrase "someone is self-centered" is usually pejorative. I think that's
true, but the person, I think that was an unfortunate choice of words, but the critic who wrote that said that her voice comes from, in large part, from its self-centeredness, literally, that
From her
it seemed to
center of
comes from the
herself.
center of herself. So although it's an unfortunate choice of words, it does, the writer does bring it back to what the real meaning of self-centered is, being centered on the self. I think without the pejorative kinds of comments.
I came across in my own reading about her, and her poetry is new for me also. I've read some of her poems over the years while I've tried to select poetry for my classes, but I've not really read into her much or read about her. But I read the poems that Amory sent out, and then I've read a few other poems, and I've come across the word cryptic applied to her poetry in a few places. And I find myself agreeing with it, but I'm not, I'd have to think in a while about what are the elements in her poetry that are cryptic. What is cryptic about her poetry? Because a lot of the experiences are so clear. Her focus is so clear about so many things. You know, that's something we could explore also.
The word cryptic sounds like someone is consciously concealing a message. And I think it could be, I came across that same word applied to her poetry, but I think I would rather say mysterious maybe, or
I've been thinking of the same word. There are mysteries in her poetry.
Yes, and that invites you to enter into the poem and really try and understand it, because it has a depth and a density that, yes, is cryptic, but I don't think purposely so. Well, I don't know. Do I agree with that?
I agree with what I just said. Lynn, I'm curious. You were gathering lots of information about her. Did you come up with any particular thoughts about Gluck as a person?
I think she has a really broad interest in the kinds of poems that she writes. The poem that you sent out, The New World, mm-hmm. I was annoyed by it, and I kept, thinking, this poem sounds like it's written by a 12-year-old judgmental little brat who's decided she's got her parents figured out, and this is just the way the world is. And it has a lot more than that in it. And it's also reminded me of Billy Collins' poetry in the sense that, you get through reading and you say, I could have said that about my parents when I was 12 years old. Why is this poem constantly being quoted? It's in lots and lots of articles about her. And
I think it's an example of how there's some austere images like, my father held her down like lead strapped to her ankles. That's really pretty perverse and awful for a child or a person even to think of that. But when Amory and I were talking about it this morning, Amory said it ends on a buoyant note because her mother is described as being liberated after her father's death. I like this poem a lot.
Get that.
Yeah, I don't think she's liberated. I think she's lost. But
yeah, I do too. Yeah, that freedom she had no idea how to handle. So she's floating in space.
Tetherless. Yeah,
that's true. But it's like an astronaut who somehow loses the ship. That indicates the lostness. So
yeah.
Let's read it.
But it is. She's free.
Yeah.
She says. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I would like to start with that one I want to reiterate something that I said when I sent them out. I was feeling not overwhelmed, but just confused on what I might pick, particularly since I didn't know her work at all. and was so delighted when I came across the writer from the New York Times literature section or some such thing saying, well, she won the Nobel Prize this year, and many of you don't know anything about her poetry. So here are the ones I suggest you start with. And I thought, well, bless your heart, lady. That's just what I needed. And I'm thankful for that, and thankful for kind of the variety of the three. I'm apologize that the way I printed it out, the title on the second one, Matins, didn't really show up as a title, and I'm hoping you didn't try to read that as the first line of the poem. But yeah, let's do New World first. Linda, you want to read it?
Sure. New World. As I saw it all my mother's life, my father held her down like lead strapped to her ankles. She was buoyant by nature. She wanted to travel, go to theater, go to museums. What he wanted was to lie on the couch with the Times over his face, so that death, when it came, wouldn't seem a significant change. In couples like this, where the agreement is to do things together, it's always the active one who concedes, who gives. You can't go to museums with someone who won't open his eyes. I thought my father's death would free my mother. In a sense, it has. She takes trips, looks at great art, but she's floating, like some child's balloon that gets lost the minute it isn't held. Or like an astronaut who somehow loses the ship and has to drift in space, knowing, however long it lasts, that what's left of being alive, she's free in that sense, without relation to Earth.
Do you all know what a class 1 air is? Have you ever heard that term?
Mm-mm.
Clasp?
Class 1 air.
Air or error?
Error, ERROR.
Okay, error. Okay. No.
I can hardly wait to find out, though.
It's an agreement to do things together. It's actually a terminology from permaculture. And it's like building a house in a flood zone. Somebody builds a house and forever after, everybody who owns that house deals with the ramifications of doing that. The government has to deal with, everybody has to deal with, because there was a class error made.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this poem, maybe the reason I'm thinking it was written by a 12-year-old is because it reminds me of the 1950s, when couples used to wear shirts alike. They used to go everywhere together. But the idea that when you got married, you were somehow tethered to this person. You didn't get to do anything on your own any longer. And so that's why this poem seems like written by a 12-year-old, because when I was 12-year-old, that was pretty much the idea of what marriage was. So I thought that, the most important lines in this poem were those two lines, were the agreement to do things together.
Oh.
So
As I was pulling these things together and thinking about sharing today, I was remembering how much I appreciate the meaning, the content of poetry, without really understanding the techniques that were used to express those ideas. And so I want to take a look at meaning, and then look to you for, so how did she do that? Or not, if you think she wasn't successful. But in this one, I thought the first line was really important as I saw it. Now, she's not saying this is how it was, but she's saying maybe as that 12-year-old you're talking about, Lynn, this is what it looked like to me. And in the last paragraph, she's still sort of doing that. In a sense, she likes to take trips. It's the outsider, it's the child interpreting what it is that the parents are about.
But I don't think it was I don't think Louise Gluck was envisioning herself as a 12-year-old
No.
writing about her parents.
I'm using Lynn's
And I don't
words.
think you're saying that either, Lynn.
No, it's me reading it from my 12-year-old self.
Yeah.
I'm remembering that that's the way I thought about that was the level at which I observed my parents.
So what do we think the grown-up Louise Gluck meant by this? Or what is she saying to us?
As I've read the poems several times, the poem really resonates for me, and partly because of how I saw my own parents' relationship, which I won't tell you a lot about. You wouldn't be interested. Well, actually, you would be.
Yeah, we would.
But in a nutshell, my mother tried to please my father throughout their marriage. Never entirely succeeded, but it was almost her raison d'etre. And I've thought about that a lot. We looked at Sharon Olds' poems about her family and especially about her father.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've gone back to this poem several times, I'm struck that it's not an expression of anger. The poem doesn't become a vehicle for her dealing with pain and anguish. It really, the thing I really like about it is the clarity, the attempt to clarify for herself what was her parents' relationship, what was the impact on her mother, and the way in which she was close enough to view it. You know, I can't say it's just objective, but it's an interesting neutral assessment, I think, of what their relationship was.
I think her initial observation, she had it wrong, and that's the part where she goes through the poem and figures out what the relationship really was about, and discovers that there was a connection there. And I think this is what we often do in all of our relationships, is that we learn something about somebody, and we have these agreements, whether they're stated or unstated, which leads us to live a life under kind of false circumstances or expectations. And then when you have that opportunity to reflect and look back, you see that there was more to it than what you had observed in the first place. Your evaluation was wrong. So to me, it's like, I like the way that she progresses through that and makes sense of it at the end.
Yeah. In the third stanza, she really returns to, I guess it would be considered current times, because she has this, the first two are a memory. And then she comes back to this observation, which I think is a very adult observation, something we all do as adults when we're trying to figure out the meaning of life and why we're here. We like to look back and try to analyze our own home life. So she has this moment where she goes, in couples like this, where the agreement is to do things together. So she's met couples. She's had an experience with couples, maybe her own couple life. So that's the voice of experience. But then she comes back to the reaction of her father's death and the way her mom reacted to it. So I like that. She kind of right in the middle of the poem, because she could have, if she had put it up on top, I think it would have sounded kind of prestigious, a little too haughty. But she puts it right in the middle, this little moment where she's reflecting and kind of bringing in some current wisdom versus childlike observation.
We were talking about mysteries in her poetry. That sentence in the second section, when she says what he wanted was to lie on the couch with the Times over his face. I've never thought of the title of the Times as having those layers to it. What a rich name for the newspaper that covers his face, with the Times over his face, so that death, when it came, wouldn't seem a significant change.
Wow.
The sense of that sentence is that that's his purpose in covering his face with the Times, so that he can ease him to death. But of course, we know that's not why he lies there that way. And so the sentence raises the question, is that her characterization of his motive? And is it colored by his sense of his doing nothing except lying there waiting for death? And, you know, it's so rich, all the layers of intent and his purposelessness at the same time. And that's what I think enriches that comment in the next section. You can't go to museums with someone who won't open his eyes.
Mm.
That is a powerful passage. I mean, the whole poem
that is exceedingly powerful.
Of her father.
Because it implies, yes, you might be able to make someone go to the museum with you, but if they won't look.
Oh, and I've seen that. I've been to a museum where there's one of the husband or the wife or the man, you know, someone in that group is like, how did I get talked into this? I hate this. I don't want to be here.
Yeah, that whole, well, you might make me come, but you can't make me like it.
That's taking your 12-year-old to the museum.
Oh, we did that. I dragged 7 kids through museums. It was brilliant.
This is good for you.
You know, Dorothy Parker's famous line, you can lead a whore to culture, but you can't make her think.
Oh, that's good.
Ouch.
Oh, wow.
I find myself wondering about the mother, the woman in this poem. Would she, as a young woman, have enjoyed doing the travel and all of those things she dreamed of? And he just, you know, killed that in her, so that when she had the chance to do those things, she didn't know how to do them. She had lost the ability to do that. Or did she never have those chances? But I mean, would she never have been good at doing those things? But since she couldn't, she could fantasize how wonderful it would be to be tetherless.
I think the word buoyant is a description of who she was then and now, because, well, I guess it could have double meanings, but she was buoyant by nature. That's,
yeah.
If I had to sum up her judgment in the poem with one sentence, it would be that the father reshaped the mother and made her into somebody else.
Yep.
I thought my father's death would free my mother. In a sense, it has. But she never frees herself from what he has made her in their relationship, the way she's been subservient.
I'm thinking about when Jane Fonda divorced Ted Turner. Years later, they asked her why, and she said, I didn't like who I was when I was with him. And I think that that's a common thing, phenomenon, where women shove their own personalities and their own dreams into, I don't know where, into the attic, because the family and the husband come first.
This might be an OCD, because if she's writing, you know, thinking about a kid, and she's in the 50s, and what the expectation was, I mean, the constraint is the dad, but it's also the agreement that they have in that time of what a married couple was supposed to look like and do. And so,
Yeah.
I'd like us to have some time to take a look at the next two. May I ask you, though, before we leave New World, what do you think of it as a piece of poetry? I thought this discussion of what it means was fascinating, but is it well written?
I
Is
feel
it-
like there's a lot of air and earth elements in here. And potentially they could have complemented each other. People who are too earthy and too grounded need a little bit of air, and people who are too full of air need to be grounded. So she has this kind of play with words and implications that I find poetic.
I think it's well written.
I had to read the poem and keep reading it, and I believe I had to discover the poetry in it. It's so deceptive, and it's easy to just follow the narrative and the series of judgments as the relationships become clarified. But you know, she makes judgments, but they're poetically acceptable. That in couples like this, where the agreement is to do things together, it's always the active one who concedes, who gives. That's not a judgment as much as a recognition. And I think those recognitions unfold in the poems, and they're very legitimate sectioning of the series of revelations as she explores and looks back on her parents. I think it's a really powerful poem in its themes and in its techniques, and in especially the way the sections operate. And the language just really deceptively simple. Like A.E. Housman's poems.
The next is more personal because she's writing about herself, I think, as opposed to observing family. Ron, would you, and a reminder in case you had forgotten, Matins, morning prayers.
Oh,
That,
I was thinking mornings, so yes, matins.
but
Yeah.
it is in churchy talk. It is the term for morning prayer.
Right.
Oh.
Ron, do you want to read that one?
Sure, happy to. You want to know how I spend my time? I walk the front lawn, pretending to be weeding. You ought to know I'm never weeding on my knees, pulling clumps of clover from the flower beds. In fact, I'm looking for courage, for some evidence my life will change, though it takes forever, checking each clump for the symbolic leaf, and soon the summer is ending, already the leaves turning. Always the sick trees going first, the dying turning, brilliant yellow while a few dark birds perform their curfew of music. You want to see my hands as empty now as at the first note? Or was the point always to continue without a sign?
I had to Google the definition of matins.
And you found morning prayer, right?
Yeah, I did. And I found also the morning song of birds, which really excited me.
I was surprised when Linda was telling me what she had found out about Glick as being depressive and compared to Sylvia Plath, because my first reading of her had not made me feel that way. I got to say that hearing Ron read this poem, I heard it differently than reading it to myself, and to me, this does tap into some of that despair, perhaps.
Amory and I were talking this morning about appreciating the way Ron reads, because he seems in the way he paces a poem to help us better understand the meaning through the rhythm.
I'm going to sign off right now. It's not going to get better than this.
That's
You
true
could
because
say
there's a
that.
but right after the no. No, there's not.
Oh, no, no buts. No
We
buts.
really said that this morning, honestly.
Thank you.
We really did.
But
So
Dave,
what's to say? I'm pretty sure that the point of all of this is the last two lines, or was the point always to continue without a sign? There's this sense of dailiness to this, that this isn't unusual. This isn't, oh my golly, this one morning I'm doing this thing. I think it's more a sense of, you see me doing this, you think I'm a good gardener, but I'm really to suck all the juice out of this. I'm just really looking for a 4-leaf clover before I can start my day. I'm looking for some luck.
When I got to the last lines, I thought, where did those come from? Was the point
Yes.
always to continue without a sign? And my habit is to look back through the poem to see what that came from. And she says, you ought to know I'm never weeding. In fact, I'm looking for courage, for some evidence, and then for the symbolic leaf, each clump for the symbolic leaf.
Mhm.
And that really resonated for me, where you're doing something and without realizing it, you're looking for some impetus for the occasion or for your life or whatever. And is the point always to continue without a sign is actually a way of describing the way life proceeds, not the way we intend or the way we'd like, or in the way that all of our connecting of signs and meanings somehow impel us, or propel us, but it just goes on.
Mm-hmm.
I had a very visceral reaction to this poem, similar to Lynn's thinking about herself as a 12-year-old girl. And my reaction was this: want to know how I spend my time? It came from that first line with my former husband saying, "What did you do all day?" And so, yes, I was on my knees doing all kinds of work, the gardening of being a mother and a housewife, and trying to find, to look for courage. Eventually, I'll be very personal, I found that courage by being with Amory, because I feel good when I am with her in ways that I never did before with my former husband. So that is perhaps not what she wanted us to collect from that poem, but that's what I took. And even the format of it as a matin, a morning prayer, I think we say prayers during our life while we are weeding, while we are gardening, while we are listening to a few dark birds.
Who do you think she's talking to or asking the question of in that first sentence?
But I was just going to ask that, Mike. When she says, you ought to know in line 3, and then she explains herself, if like she's talking to somebody, somebody on the street, perhaps a neighbor who might be able to see into her yard. You ought to know, I'm never weeding, who is she talking to?
Well, it's the same person in the last question that she would be talking to. So if she's looking for, is it God? Because she's looking for purpose, or trying to figure out what her purpose or value is. And
Ron, did you come to understand some understanding of those last lines that just appear on the scene? And I felt the same thing, strange irrelevance. I'm still not sure what they mean, or was the point always to continue without a sign?
Well, at first I thought it was just the point where she got cryptic. But it made me aware as I tried to explore that question then that it's cryptic is more acceptable in her poetry. But it stopped me for the poem to end there. And
Yeah.
why did she think that it
Yeah.
was concluded there?
Is it for drama?
I'm thinking that while she says she's looking for courage, to me it's because poetically to say that I'm looking for significance does not work. It's too direct. And to me, what she's looking for is significance, and those last two lines are what tell you that.
You don't think it's direction or an answer?
I think that our sense that we are always in our life trying to move in the direction of significance.
That's interesting.
Hmm.
I read the end of that. I did have question marks all over it when I on my sheet here of things that I might say to you. But it seems like that recognition that so many of us have, that you just got to keep going on, that it would be nice if the 4-leaf clover came, or if the answer came, if the horoscope really told you what it is you should do that day. But that doesn't happen. So you keep going, and tomorrow you look again and see if there's some message. God, is this the day you're going to tell me what it's all about? But no,
That's what courage is, though. Courage is going forth without anybody telling you should go forth.
And sticking around even though you have no
Good.
significance whatsoever to the world.
I think it's interesting that the title of the poem, with its religious implications and its probably Latin or French derivation, is kind of a signal for the seriousness of the poem. She doesn't call it morning prayer.
Ah,
And
so is she talking to her God?
Well, I don't know if she is or not. I just think it adds a layer of spirituality to the poem that you wouldn't get with just a plainer title.
Because it implies that
Prayerfulness.
she's familiar with the term, and you should be too.
And we are
Well,
now.
Yeah.
I am.
As in there it is. That's what I've called it. And so I assume you know what it means. Yeah.
I think the you in the poem, and this is not rocket science, is anyone who might be inclined to ask. And that first line, you want to know how I spend my time? I don't see that as really posing a question to a potential listener. That the phrase self-centeredness, it's about her. It's not about what the other person may be thinking. What Henry James would call her interlocutor.
Oh,